Hi, I'm Doug Wright for New York Theater Workshop, and we've all just lived through a very tumultuous time politically. And it's my personal contention that through it all, it's comedians and humorists who have emerged as our true patriots. In fact, a lot of them are the sources where we get our hard news. Many of us would rather curl up in front of The Daily Show than face NBC Tonight. And I think that says something not only about the state of politics, but also about the role of the jester in our collective court. And to talk about that, I'm assembling a number of the most talented satirists, humorists, and comedians in the field to test my theory and see how they regard their role in the larger political sphere. And to launch this series, I couldn't be more thrilled. We have someone that I deeply admire and whose pieces in The New Yorker over the last 4 years have literally kept me and many others sane. He's certainly known for the Borowitz report in that august publication, but that's only a fraction of the remarkable things he's done in his career. A prolific television writer, he created the hit series The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which was an enormous success and launched the acting career of Will Smith. He's a New York Times bestselling author with an anthology on humor that's really a primer in the field, and also an autobiographical memoir on Kindle. And he's been a film producer, an actor. He's a frequent stand-up comedian. So I'm so honored to have Andy Borowitz of the Borowitz Report.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you so much. So what do you think of my theory? Do you think it holds water?
That I am important? Is that your theory?
That you are not only important, but that you have achieved a kind of patriotic status through your acute eye for satire and for putting our political leaders in a healthy and necessary perspective.
Well, I think it's important for me, and I think for most of us, to under-promise and over-deliver. So I tend to set my sights a little bit low in terms of how much I think I can achieve in the patriotic realm. I am just a clown. I'm just trying to make people laugh. But as you know, Doug, as a playwright and as a man of the theater, you can usually make people laugh the best and the loudest if you're telling the truth. If there's a false moment in a play, that's usually when you're not getting the laugh and you have to go back and do some more writing or something. And the same is kind of true with stand-up or satire, written satire, what I do for the New Yorker. If something strikes a chord, it's usually because it's true and people perceive it as true. And interestingly enough, I think one of the reasons why people like John Oliver or Stephen Colbert or Trevor Noah, any of these really great comedians of our time, have really thrived in this current environment is because they are sort of the truth tellers, and a lot of what we're seeing on the news seems somehow clouded. I feel that as much as I'd like to get my news from CNN, I sometimes feel that they're trying so hard to have a point of view that I just want to say, hey guys, will you just tell me what happened? I just want to hear what happened. And they, by the way, are by far, of the three major cable news networks in this country, are by far the most objective. So what I say goes doubly. Obviously, Fox, I won't even discuss that as a news channel. And MSNBC, I sort of regard as Fox for vegans. It's the same format, but they're just saying things that I agree with. But I actually like news from people like the BBC, who are very neutral and almost boring in their reporting style. They're not, every now and then there's a slight raised eyebrow in that British way. But in general, they're not trying to hammer home a point, or at least I'm not seeing it. Maybe if I lived in the UK, I would sense more bias from them. But I think in a weird way, we've swapped places. Comedians have swapped places with some of these news organizations because we appear, at any rate, to be telling the truth, because that's the only way we're going to get a laugh.
Mhm, mhm. That's really well said and beautifully observed. And I noticed that as another indicator that these roles have become enmeshed in a way, is that the National Press Club now gives an award for humor. And in fact, you were the first recipient of that award. And it struck me that this organization dedicated to journalists would now be honoring humorists among their rank.
Yeah, that was kind of a trippy thing. It was very strange. I remember when I received that award, I looked down the audience, and there were all these people I was used to seeing on TV broadcasting the straight news. And I thought, well, this is kind of weird. I don't know if this is some kind of practical joke that they're playing on me, but it's interesting. I mean, I think satire has always been important in the role it's played in culture. I'm always thinking back to Jonathan Swift, and when some of us were in high school, we got taught his essay, A Modest Proposal, which is kind of the ur text of English language satire. And interestingly, that's going back to the 18th century, the reign of Queen Anne, I'm going to say. Am I correct?
I trust you.
Well, that's a bad mistake. I'm a little more up to date on current politics than 18th century British politics. Sadly, that's a gap in my education. But I do remember from reading that Modest Proposal, which of course was his satirical proposal that the poor should avoid starvation by eating their children, was widely regarded as an authentic, honest suggestion, including by the Queen. The Queen thought that it was shocking that somebody would actually propose this. And now, if you go, 300 years later, approximately, people are shocked that news like the news I do, satirical news, or satirical news like what The Onion does, is mistaken for the real news, as if this is a suddenly new development. And it isn't. It's the same thing. It's when you seek to tell the truth, and believe me, we all may seek to tell the truth and miss quite a bit of the time, because the truth is a slippery thing. It's often mistaken for real reporting or real news. And so often people think that that's a new development that has something to do with Facebook and algorithms and all that. And that does play a role, but it's not a new development, as very little is new when it comes down to it.
No, that's really true. Have you always, you're an expert, you have expertise in a lot of different realms. Like you wrote a book about American humor, which was really authoritative and named 50 major humorists. You've also written a very funny and very poignant memoir about illness. Have you always been a political animal? And was the Borowitz Report a kind of natural evolution and step into an interest you'd long held? Or was it something you came to relatively later in your writerly evolution?
I would say later. I think I was always interested in politics. I've tried to bury this in my resume, Doug, but I was actually one of the people trying to write jokes for Michael Dukakis when he ran in 1988. We know how well that went. Michael Dukakis was often hilarious, but not intentionally, which was kind of a problem. If we could just have captured that lightning in a bottle, it might have been a whole different story, but it wasn't to be. I've always been interested in politics, sort of the way I've always been interested in sports. I mean, it's an interesting thing to follow. It sometimes bears some relationship to how we lead our lives, and other times it really is just kind of a sideshow. But I think what really attracted me to write about it in, I guess, around 2000, the year 2000 was when I started, 2001, was that I realized that politicians give you the same thing that you get if you're writing a really interesting TV series. You get recurring characters who have somewhat predictable responses to events, and it becomes fun to mine that and to mine those characters. It's not really that different from the theater, where, or if you look at something like the Commedia dell'arte, where you have these types, and types become really important. If you're writing about current events on a daily basis, you want characters who deliver a certain response or reaction every time you cut to them. And so to me, what's really interesting about politics isn't so much, it isn't anything more than just character, I've got to say. I think you have characters that become fun to write for and interesting, and sometimes it's fun to write against type. It's fun the audience has assumed one thing about a character, and so there's comedy, and there's an opportunity to shine a light on that character by doing almost the opposite of what we would expect them to do. So it's really just character. I think, Will Rogers, who's one of the legendary American comedians who was in that anthology that I put together, Will Rogers was, I guess, kind of the Trevor Noah of his time. He would do a show in New York long before TV, up on the roof of one of the hotels in the Broadway area, and he would do jokes. He would do jokes and cowboy rope tricks every night. I guess Trevor Noah does not do rope tricks, but that was Will Rogers. His act was that he was kind of a plain-spoken cowboy who would, as you would say, be a jester. He would tell the truth and make all these jokes about the city slickers in Washington. That was his whole shtick. And Will Rogers had a great line about writing or performing political satire. He said, "There's no trick to being a political humorist when you have the whole government working for you." And that says it, right? I mean, it's like, when you're writing a play and it's really happening for you and it's really cooking, it's because the characters have come alive. Mm-hmm. And you also know, probably you've had the experience of the opposite, where it's hard to get them to come alive. And that's when you feel like throwing your computer out the window or whatever. But the great thing I think about writing about politics is that the characters and their behavior just provides an endless stream of material. You never run out.
That's terrific. And let me ask you, I've heard both opinions. I've heard that Trump has been a gift to people in your field, and I've also heard that he can make humorists lazy, because all they have to do is put a clip up of his latest eccentric behavior. Has he made your life easier or more difficult in terms of what you do?
Well, I think probably if you're the host of a late night show, I would have to say it's made your life easier, because you can just put up a clip. And I mean, Jon Stewart had this same, gravy train rolling when George W. Bush was president, because you would just throw up the latest Bushism, and then Jon Stewart had a million hilarious takes to the camera. In my line of work, as a guy who writes this stuff, and writes really, it's all text. I don't have the opportunity to use any video. I also don't, at the New Yorker. The New Yorkers, you have to keep in mind, only recently discovered photography. We discovered photography like within the last, I don't know, I think, did Tina Brown discover photography at the New Yorker, like in the 90s? So we're a little bit slow on the uptake when it comes to all of this newfangled technology. Like, they are doing some video now. But when you're writing about Trump, I would say that he's made our jobs harder. And the reason I say that, at least my job, just speaking for myself, the reason I say that is because my job as somebody who writes fake news, satirical news, is to try to think of something that Trump would do and then come up with something much more insane than that, something really bizarre. And what will happen with me, and this has happened many times, I will think of the most psychotic thing that Trump could ever do and write it, and 10 minutes later, he will do that thing. So my news at that point isn't fake, it's just early. And that really isn't the goal here. I'm not trying to scoop anything. No, I think, I remember when I was writing sitcoms and I was a showrunner and I was in the writer's room, a lot of time, one of our kind of mantras that would come up again is, I would say you can't do a joke on a joke. You know, it's like you've already done the joke, then don't take it one step further and make a joke about that joke. Now you're like making a copy of a copy, and it's getting a little blurry. And you know, the joke was the thing that landed, so move on. And writing about Trump is really kind of doing a joke on a joke sometimes, or you know, trying to make. I think it's why, you know, there have been a lot of TV series that have been, you know, there was I think Comedy Central did a show where it was a really good Trump imitator doing Trump, you know, doing all these Trump sketches, and also there was I think an animated show about Trump. And I think these things have a really hard time living up to just how bizarre he really is. I mean, that performance that he did on Thanksgiving, when he was inexplicably sitting behind that tiny kind of Melissa and Doug desk and just railing on Thanksgiving, railing about all the things, how unjustly he'd been treated. I had earlier in the day published a story in the New Yorker about Melania sending Trump to the children's table at Thanksgiving for really behavior quite similar to what we witnessed a few hours later. So again, I think that is illustrative of how he has made my job harder, because in a way I prefer to write about people like Mitt Romney. Now, of course, Mitt Romney, you know, the old Mitt Romney when he was running against Obama was great because he was this very wooden, seemingly robotic guy who just had made a ton of money in private equity and was very boring and had no charisma. And that was actually a really good target. That's somebody fun to make fun of. It, you know, if you were writing a play and you had a dinner party scene, that would be a character you'd want to throw stuff to, because it would be hilarious just how out of touch and incapable of human interaction he was. Now, of course, Mitt Romney, we now overvalue him because compared to all the other Republicans, he seems like Mandela. So now we all worship at the shrine of Mitt Romney. But Mitt Romney, to me, is a really good satirical target because he's not inherently funny. Trump is just too big an inflated parade blimp to really be a good character. He's you know, he's obviously very mentally ill, and that takes a certain amount of the comedy out of it, in my view. And again, like his behavior, when to actually hear the way he talks and certain things that he's done. I mean, a great example to me was when he encouraged everybody to drink bleach. I mean, if I had submitted that story to the New Yorker, I think it would have been rejected. I think they would have said that's just beyond the pale. So it's a very long-winded way of saying harder. He's made it hard.
It's a vivid and great way. And I'm so glad that you cite mental illness, only because I feel like the same way that if families have a seriously mentally ill member in their midst, their first impulse is always to attempt to normalize it at any cost.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what the Republican Party has tried to do, but it is truly diagnosable illness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to hear your candor about that. Given Trump's enormity and scale, and given his maybe unsurpassability as a certain kind of commedia character, are you anxious at all about the comparative normalcy that looms ahead of us in a Biden administration?
Well, no. I mean, I have to hearken back to the Will Rogers comment, because really the most terrifying moment, I think, for most comedians was when Obama was inaugurated, because he was very, very good at, first of all, being funny himself. He was very smart. He hired good writers. So he was actually a good comedian. And that, as I said, you can't do a joke on a joke. If a guy is being genuinely funny and making good jokes, that in a way is a form of armor. It makes it harder to turn that guy into the rube or the chump or the foil, you know what I mean? So that was terrifying, but actually, as it played out, somehow comedians feasted for those 8 years when Obama was president. And it's because of the freakouts that he caused in other people. He just absolutely, he created in his own way the Tea Party. Mm-hmm. The Koch brothers went nuts. John Boehner. You had all the way they kept on. You talk about predictable behavior, as I was saying with the Commedia dell'arte reference, which, by the way, I don't usually do that. I just do that when I'm talking to theater folk, just to make it clear.
A good one.
I think Bergson, in his theory of comedy, said that one of the funniest things, one of the essences of comedy, was kind of robotic, mechanical, repetitive behavior. Mm-hmm. That's why if you have a character and you cut to him and he's always kind of saying the same thing, that's funny because we perceive it as this kind of robotic response, and it's ludicrous. Mm-hmm. Well, the Republican Party, when Obama was president, had their own version of that, which is they kept on repealing Obamacare. They repealed Obamacare something like 75 times. And that became a running gag for me. It just was, the repetitiousness of that was hilarious. So Joe Biden of years gone by was in fact a hilarious character in his own right. He was a gaffe machine. He plagiarized a speech by the British Labour politician Neil Kinnock, which I urge everyone to go on YouTube and watch the mashup, because the first thing that this happened in 1987, and the first thing that you ask when you see Joe Biden ripping off Neil Kinnock's speech is, why would you rip off a speech by that guy? Neil Kinnock seemed to be a raving lunatic from Wales who was speaking in this insanely overblown way. What about that speech would you see and say, that is the speech I want to rip off? Joe Biden of 30 years ago was eminently mockable. But something really weird happened this year, which is that Joe Biden finally got good management. It's just like an actor who keeps on taking bad roles, and finally some agent or manager gets a hold of him or her and says, no, you've been playing the wrong parts. You shouldn't be trying to be a romantic lead. You should be playing the heavy. You should be playing character roles like Hugh Grant, right? Mm-hmm. And that's finally happened. Somebody got to Biden and said, look, we've got to talk less. We've got to keep you downstairs in the basement. And when you do speak, you're going to be very controlled and very disciplined and stick to the script. You're not going to improvise, Joe. And you know what? It really worked. So now we have a very, very restricted Joe Biden. It's sort of like he is on a diet of 200 words a day. And that's all we're hearing from him. And so that has made him a little bit less juicy as a target, I've got to say. But invariably, his opponents, much as with Obama, his opponents are going to be hilarious. They're already hilarious because people like Lindsey Graham are refusing to acknowledge the existence of Joe Biden. Joe Biden is like this mythical figure who does not exist. He's like the tooth fairy. And so already that we're setting up this, Joe Biden is the most mild, moderate, dare I say, white guy in the country. He has very few distinguishing characteristics at this stage of his life. He's sort of a beige color. He's got white hair. And I would say on the color wheel, he's very close to the white. Maybe you could paint your living room in a color called Joe Biden and it would offend nobody. He's like the color that you see in some of our, like in a hotel room. It's that color that offends no one. So after years of struggle, that's what Joe Biden has become. He's become the least objectionable person in the country. And it will be hilarious seeing the Republicans try to paint him as a card-carrying Antifa member, which they will.
I have to say, just hearing you discourse on him for even a few minutes has me gleeful with anticipation about the next 4 years of the Borowitz report. Let me ask you, I was quite sincere when I said in the opening that I have looked to the Borowitz report as a source of sanity and consolation and a necessary corrective to these last 4 years. But by the same token, I know that it's published in the New Yorker, and I think we would agree that that is a publication that appeals to a certain level of intelligence and probably a liberal sensibility at heart and a literary pedigree of sorts. And do you ever feel like you're preaching to the converted?
I feel that I'm preaching to converted 100% of the time. And it's interesting. It's interesting that the whole concept of preaching to the choir is an interesting one, because a lot of times people will say to you, "Oh, but come on, you're not, nobody, you're not challenging your readers. You're not saying terrible things about the Democrats, and you're not saying nice things about Trump." There is actually kind of a strain of comedy right now that says, really, to be a true comedian, you've got to avoid saying nasty things about Trump, because that's what everybody does. What you really should be doing is finding the hypocrisy in Democrats and really taking down the Democrats. I beg to differ about that, because it does come down to a little bit of what you said at the beginning about patriotism. I don't think anybody is going to really feel great looking back 20 years from now saying, "Boy, I'm really glad when Donald Trump was president that I really gave him a free ride, but I took down all those horrible liberals that were trying to stop him." I don't think that's going to really be a good look. But I'm not so much interested in how I look. I'm a little bit interested in making the world incrementally, and by incrementally I mean infinitesimally, better. I don't think that I have a big impact on the world, but I do think that if I reach a few million people with my writing, which seems to be the case, and I go on tour, which I did in the last couple of years. I did a national stand-up tour where I raised money for the International Rescue Committee to try to undo some of the damage that we've done to refugees during the Trump years. My goal was very much to preach to the choir for this reason. A lot of the choir has spent the last 4 years so depressed and so in such a kind of state of despair that they needed something to lift them out of that depression so they could do some positive things like register to vote, register other people to vote, vote themselves, raise money for candidates, canvass, work on campaigns. And at my shows, which I guarantee were attended 100% by the choir, people would come up to me and they'd say what you said, which was a very flattering thing. They would say, "Your writing has really helped keep me sane." And I, being kind of an annoying person, would come back to them and say, "Well, that's very nice. So tell me, what are you doing with your sanity? Are you just feeling better and sleeping well at night? Are you just saying, oh, I'm laughing, so I guess it's not really so bad? Why don't you use your sanity and actually do something to have regime change in this country? Get to work, even for a local candidate. Do what you can." And I think, again, I like to underpromise and overdeliver. I don't have great, lofty ideas about what satire or comedy can achieve. I don't think it changes people's minds. I really don't. And I think that it tends to reinforce people's opinions that they already hold. But there's nothing wrong with that. Martin Luther King had a great quote, which I think I'm paraphrasing here, but I'll do my best. Somebody said to Martin Luther King, when you give your speeches, you're really just preaching to the choir. Now, that, by the way, is a really interesting critique to make of a preacher, because that actually is what he does for a living. But it said, you're really just preaching to the choir. And he said, well, if you don't preach to the choir, the music stops. And I thought, that really sums it up. By the way, just so this doesn't get taken out of context, I am not comparing myself to Martin Luther King. Not by the way, and no one ever has. But I think it would be, I'm really surprised. I would be very surprised if anything I have written would ever cause, say, one of the Koch brothers, the surviving Koch brother, which I guess is Charles Koch. I'd be very surprised if he would read one of my columns and say, you know, he makes a really good point about income inequality. I just don't see that happening. But I do think somebody who might be listening today, watching this interview, might think, you know, he makes a good point about my not being such a passive participant in politics. Maybe as a result of a laugh or two that I might have gotten from those columns, maybe I should rethink my relationship to society a little bit, not in a massive or grandiose way, but just maybe I should do one little thing to make the world incrementally better. And even if that means maybe driving to the food bank and dropping off a box of food, or doing anything, I really think each of us, when we talk about patriotism, it's a mistake for anyone to get too grandiose about how much one person can do. Even Barack Obama, you know, he accomplished some things, but a lot of his changes were incremental, really. I mean, he didn't upset the apple cart, really. He made sure that tens of millions of people could get affordable health care. He didn't introduce single payer. He didn't, you know, turn it into the public option the way a lot of European social democracies have. He did something very incremental. Now, Barack Obama, who is the president of the United States, could only do something incremental. That really puts me in my place. I have to be like way down here somewhere. So that's my only goal, is make people laugh and hope that if I am preaching the choir, which I am, that the choir will become motivated to make the world a little bit better.
Well, you also made me think of something I hadn't considered when I started this little series, which is not only the power you have in your writing, but also the way that you apply your comedy towards something like the Refugee Project, where you may not be precipitating change in the print on the page per se, or even keeping people sane, but you can still use your comic skills to raise money for an essential cause. And that's another dimension to, I think, the kind of activism that your ilk engage in, which is an interesting thought as well. Is that something you do often?
You know, it's become, as I've gotten older, it's something I've thought more about. When you're young, all you're thinking about, at least all I was thinking about, was, can I even do this? Mm-hmm. Can I even succeed? Can I not get fired from the first TV show I was working on? You know, that sort of thing. It was, the first TV show I was working on was actually Archie Bunker, and I was on a 7-week contract. And after my 7-week contract was up, I was offered another 7-week contract. So at that point, you're not really thinking about how am I going to raise money for Planned Parenthood. You're really just thinking about, oh my God, can I even do this? Was this a mistake? Should I have gone to law school? You're just really, it's just triage at that point. You're thinking about, can I survive doing this? After doing it for a while, I now, you know, I care about my work and I care about doing a good job. But I don't have that same inward-facing attitude that I had when I was, say, 22. It's just become more outward-facing. I think that's just a function of getting older and seeing your responsibility to the community a little more clearly. I do think, you know, we knock Facebook a lot, and Facebook has certainly been responsible for a lot of ills. But one thing that is really great about social media is when, you know, abortion clinics, which are still under great threat around the country, and certainly with the current configuration of the Supreme Court will continue to be so, when abortion clinics are threatened and women's reproductive rights are jeopardized, I've been able to post a link to Planned Parenthood. And just by writing a post that really took me 1 minute of my time to say, hey, everybody, this is how you can help support women's reproductive rights, I've been able to raise $50,000. And so I think, like, okay, well, if at the end of the day, all the work I've done and to build up this audience results in that. That's such a more concrete achievement than some career goal. It really is, because I mean, as you know, career stuff, even the successes are very evanescent. You know, they're very exciting when they happen, and then you're stuck behind the keyboard the next day saying, what am I going to write today? So that comes and goes. But the thought that maybe through some of the activism I've done, which quite honestly has been really a lot of fun. I'm not like Jimmy Carter up on some ladder trying to put on roof shingles or something. I really, it's been an outgrowth of what I do anyway. Mm-hmm. The fact that like touring the country was great fun and a great challenge. And the fact that we were able to raise as much money as we did to help refugees was so satisfying. More satisfying than when it's just, when your eye is just on the prize of your own personal success. But in a way, you have to get over that hump. You have to get over that career hump of trying to be successful, I feel like, to make the other thing happen. I mean, a bunch of comedians got together in 2008 and we did this series of shows in New York called The Audacity of Jokes. And we were people like Jim Gaffigan and me and a bunch of guys and women. And we raised a lot of money for Obama, and that was really positive. But it was like all of these guys had worked hard. They'd achieved a certain currency and success, and they had really polished their craft. And now they were using it to do something outward facing. So yeah, that to me is probably at this phase of my life the most satisfying aspect of what I do.
Well, I'll end, Andy, on a surprising note of commonality between us that I wasn't aware of. And that's that my first paid writing job out of graduate school was to develop new situation comedies for Norman Lear's Act 3 productions.
Oh my God.
And I wasn't terribly good at it, or I'd still be living on the other coast. But we share Norman in common, it sounds. And arguably, he's one of the great figures who blended comedy and politics in a mass market way with All in the Family and other shows. Do you think he wielded a kind of lasting influence on you?
You know, it's funny. We do have some commonality in that area. It's interesting. And I didn't know that about you. My first job in Hollywood when I was 22 was writing for Norman's partner, Bud Yorkin. And Bud had directed. Bud is one of the unsung heroes of television. One of the reasons he's an unsung hero is because his partner was Norman Lear, and Norman Lear was so charismatic and so great. Norman Lear might have been the first TV producer whose name I knew as a kid, because I loved All in the Family and I loved all the Jeffersons and all those shows. And I never really thought of a TV producer. I mean, I guess on the FBI, they always said a Quinn Martin production. So other than that, I didn't even know what a producer was. I still don't really know, because some seem to do a lot more than others do. But Norman and Bud shared offices in a part of LA called Century City, which you probably were familiar with during your time out there. And Bud was kind of a little bit under the radar, not just because of Norman's enormous profile, but also Bud was the director, which is sometimes in situation comedy especially kind of an undervalued role. You know, we hear a lot these days about showrunners. There's this. I was a showrunner before being a showrunner was cool. I want to say that I wasn't invited on lots of panels and speak at the AFI and stuff like that. I was just some clown eating Chinese food at 3 a.m. That's who I was. But Norman had a very shrewd instinct for finding British sitcoms that had been very successful, and then finding a way of adapting them to American audiences. He did that not just with All in the Family, which was a British sitcom called Till Death Do Us Part, but also Sanford and Son was a British comedy called Steptoe and Son. And he would do this time and time again. And there's a real genius to that because, as you know, comedy does not travel well. I mean, it is very unusual for, I mean, now there's kind of an American style of comedy that is global because the advent of satellite and streaming, there's like, you know, you can watch American sitcoms all over the world. But back in the 70s, when Norman really became a pioneer in this area, it really had never worked. And the thing that's fascinating about All in the Family, and this should give everybody in the creative field, you know, whether it's the theater or film or anything, any of the visual arts, should give us all a lot of encouragement, is that that show had so many obstacles to success and was so completely swamped by failure in its initial stages. And Norman refused to give it up. He, believe it or not, he did 3 different pilots for that show. The first pilot featured the actor Tom Bosley as Archie Bunker.
Wow.
Who we remember from Happy Days, Mr. C. So Tom Bosley, completely wrong, you know, sort of a likable, avuncular character. And the second pilot featured Carol O'Connor, very obscure character actor who had never had a leading role in anything, really. So not a big name. And the flaw in that pilot was that the 2 kids, who were later played by Rob Reiner and Sally Struthers, were played by different actors. And I saw that pilot. It was astonishing to see how the chemistry in the cast completely faltered because you had the wrong people playing the kids. And finally, on the 3rd try, they got it right. And the show was hugely brilliant. It was pretty much, I may be getting this slightly wrong, but it was, the ratings were so bad the first season, it was really on the verge of being canceled. And it really heated up over the summer in reruns. People discovered it. And then it finally, you know, took hold. Its success gave birth to the Jeffersons because Sherman Hemsley had played George Jefferson, the neighbor on All in the Family. That gave birth to Good Times and Maude and this whole empire of Norman Lear. So yeah, he's going to, you know, it's funny, in a way, he's very influential, and yet we don't really watch those shows anymore. They're available, but they don't have the same currency. I think one of the problems as with all political comedy, mine certainly included, is that for political comedy to land, it has to be intrinsically topical, and that means that it dates very poorly. So just, you know, none of the stuff that the late night hosts or the stuff that I'm doing is going to be something that will be explicable to audiences 20 years from now. It just will be too freighted with topical references. But that's so cool to find out that you did that. How long were you working with Act 3?
I had a 3-year contract working on new shows, and one All in the Family reunion special. So,
oh, wow.
And then I fled TV with my tail between my legs and came back to New York. So it was a brief time, but it was an important one, and he became a kind of mentor figure and keeps in touch to this day, which is always deeply moving to me.
Well, you know, please, I am not in touch with him, so please give him my love. I have not seen him in a long time. I remember one other thing that Norman said in a moment of self-effacement was he said that he didn't consider himself so much a writer as a tumler, which is, I guess, a Yiddish term meaning the guy who sort of, you know, stirs the drink. He sort of gets motivated by other people. And he said that he was a great rewriter, which I think, you know, sure. As a man of the theater, you understand the importance of that. And sitcoms, especially the way Norman did them, were highly theatrical. The format of the first season of All in the Family, which they later got away from because it was too hard to do, was that the first act, it's 2 acts, it's a 2-act structure. The first act was all real time, no cuts, act break, and then the second act was all real time, no cuts.
Wow.
So that takes incredible writing to pull that off, but also amazing acting. And, you know, you had in Gene Stapleton and Carol O'Connor just these stage veterans who could pull that off. I don't think no offense to our current crop of actors on TV, but so much now is being done single camera that it doesn't really require that kind of theatrical craft and skill and experience. So it was very, very rare. And I think if you look at it now, it might seem kind of like maybe kind of dated or like vintage TV, because it is clearly very stage bound, but so hard to pull off.
Yeah, absolutely true. Absolutely true. And our theater audience will appreciate your appreciation of that. I have to say, Andy, you're that rare thing. You're that individual who is as erudite and charming and deeply funny in conversation as you are upon the page. And so I cannot thank you enough for initiating this little series and for supporting the workshop. And it's really been an incredibly enlightening, instructive, and deeply entertaining chat. So thanks from the bottom of my heart, and thanks from everyone at the workshop.
Well, thank you for having me, Doug. And I want to say that last sort of closing compliment that you graciously gave to me is now going to be my ringtone. I'm very excited about that. Whenever I feel my serotonin level dropping slightly, I will just play that, and I'll be right back up.
Please do. Please do. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.